What if everything you were ever taught about success was quietly destroying you, not in an obvious way, not in a way your friends would notice, but slowly, deeply, in the way a river erodes a stone gradually, invisibly, until one day you look at your life and wonder why all that effort brought you so little peace? Here is something most people never stop to consider. The harder you chase happiness, the more it retreats. The tighter you grip control, the faster things fall apart. And the more obsessively you try to improve your life, the further you drift from actually living it. This is not a motivational paradox. This is ancient wisdom verified not just by philosophy, but by modern psychology, neuroscience, and thousands of years of human observation. And today, we are going to go deep into one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of human history. It comes from Taoism, a philosophical and spiritual tradition that emerged in China roughly 2,500 years ago, rooted in the writings of a mysterious figure named Laozi, also spelled Lao Tzu, who authored one of the most widely translated books ever written, the Tao Te Ching, a text of only 81 short chapters. A book so compact, you could read it in an afternoon. And yet scholars, monks, scientists, and poets have spent entire lifetimes trying to unpack what it means. At its center is one radical, quietly revolutionary idea: stop trying so hard, and paradoxically, you will get so much more done. Let us begin with the question that Laozi himself was wrestling with when he wrote the Tao Te Ching in the 6th century BCE. Why do human beings consistently make their own lives worse? Look around. People spend decades accumulating things they do not need, chasing approval from people they do not even like, following rules that someone else invented, and pushing their minds and bodies to the absolute edge of exhaustion, only to arrive at the end of it all feeling empty, unsatisfied, and vaguely confused about what it was all for. Laozi had a word for the underlying force of existence. He called it the Tao. Translated loosely, it means the way. But that translation barely scratches the surface. The Tao is not a god in the traditional sense. It is not a religion. It is not a moral system. It is more like the operating system of reality itself, the invisible current running beneath every living thing, the rhythm behind the seasons, the pattern inside a wave, the intelligence in a seed that knows exactly how to become an oak tree without consulting a single rule book. Here is where it gets interesting. Laozi argued that this natural intelligence, this Tao, is always working, always flowing, always moving things exactly as they need to move. And the central problem of human life is that we keep interrupting it. We interrupt it with our opinions about how things should be. We interrupt it with our anxious planning, our need for control, our desperate grasping after outcomes. We interrupt it with our categories and our labels, our judgments of what is good versus what is bad, what is beautiful versus what is ugly. And every time we interrupt it, we generate friction, exhaustion, and suffering. Laozi wrote, and this is one of the most cited lines in the entire Tao Te Ching, that the Tao which can be named is not the eternal Tao. In other words, the moment you try to pin reality down into a fixed concept, you have already lost it, because reality is not fixed. It is alive. It is moving. And any mental model you build around it is already one step behind. The philosopher Alan Watts, who spent decades translating Eastern philosophy for Western audiences, described this beautifully. He pointed out that the entire project of Western civilization has been an attempt to nail the universe down, to categorize it, to control it, to name every flower, measure every star, regulate every human behavior, and somehow, in doing so, arrive at mastery. But what actually happens, Watts observed, is that this project creates an illusion of understanding while producing enormous amounts of psychological suffering. We become trapped inside our own conceptual frameworks. We mistake the map for the territory, and we end up living inside our heads in a world of thoughts, plans, judgments, and projections, instead of living inside actual life. This is precisely what Laozi meant when he wrote that 5 colors blind the eye, 5 notes deafen the ear, 5 flavors overwhelm the palate. At first this sounds strange. How can more information blind you? But think about it carefully. When you organize perception into fixed categories, this is red, that is blue, this is pleasant, that is painful, you gain a sense of order. But you also lose the infinite richness of what exists outside those categories. You start responding to your labels rather than to reality itself. And when this happens in daily life, the consequences are profound. The second great Taoist text, the Zhuangzi, attributed to a philosopher named Zhuangzi who lived around the 4th century BCE, takes this even further. It introduces a concept that would become central to all Taoist practice: Wu Wei. Pronounced roughly as Wu Wei, Wu Wei is typically translated as non-action or non-doing, and almost everyone misunderstands it immediately. They hear non-doing and think it means passive, lazy, or disengaged. Lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, letting the world go by. That is almost the exact opposite of what it means. Wu Wei describes a mode of action so perfectly aligned with the natural flow of a situation that it requires no force, no struggle, no internal resistance. Think of the skilled chef in the Zhuangzi who carves an ox so effortlessly that his knife glides through the natural spaces in the animal's joints, never grinding against bone. He has practiced so deeply that he no longer thinks about what he is doing. He simply moves. His knowledge has become part of him. He acts from a place of deep attunement rather than calculated effort. Or think of what psychologists today call flow state, a concept studied extensively by Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. In a state of flow, athletes, musicians, surgeons, and writers report losing their sense of self-consciousness entirely. Time distorts. Effort disappears. Action becomes effortless. Output becomes exceptional. Csikszentmihalyi spent decades documenting this state, and what he described is essentially what the Taoists were pointing to 2,500 years earlier. The mind becomes so fully absorbed in what it is doing that the usual friction of self-monitoring, self-judging, and self-questioning simply drops away. Wu Wei is not the absence of action. It is action without ego-driven interference. Now let us bring this into 3 very specific areas of modern life where most people are unknowingly working against themselves. The first is the compulsion to fix the world. There is something deeply seductive about the idea of making things better, improving systems, correcting injustices, educating the ignorant, reforming the broken. And on the surface, this impulse seems entirely good. But Laozi was deeply skeptical of it, not because improving the world is wrong, but because of what typically happens when individuals decide they have the solution. In the Zhuangzi, there is a story about a student named Yan Hui who approaches his teacher Confucius. Yes, Confucius appears in the Zhuangzi with a plan to travel to a corrupt neighboring kingdom and use his knowledge of ethics and governance to set things right. The ruler there was making disastrous decisions. The people were suffering. Surely someone as well-educated and morally serious as Yan Hui could help. Confucius gently but firmly discourages him, not because the ruler does not need help, but because Yan Hui's approach is fundamentally flawed. He is going in with the energy of moral superiority, the implicit message being, "You are wrong and I know better." Confucius points out that this posture rarely produces change. More often, it triggers defensiveness, resentment, and entrenchment. The person being corrected feels attacked rather than helped, and the reformer, no matter how well-intentioned, ends up being an obstacle rather than a solution. This observation aligns remarkably well with what modern social psychology calls the backfire effect, a phenomenon in which presenting people with evidence that contradicts their beliefs can actually cause them to hold those beliefs more strongly. Forced change is fragile. Internally generated change is durable. You cannot push a river into a different course by yelling at it. Laozi wrote that the wise person acts without forcing, teaches without speaking, and accomplishes without striving. Leadership through presence and alignment, not through domination and command. The second area is the endless pursuit of happiness. This one is particularly urgent in the modern world because we have built entire industries around it. Self-help books, productivity systems, wellness apps, coaching programs, motivational content of every kind. All of it promising that if you just follow this framework, adopt this habit, or think this way, happiness will finally arrive. But here is what the Taoists noticed, and here is what modern research is confirming. The direct pursuit of happiness is one of the most reliable ways to prevent it. Psychologist Iris Moss at the University of California, Berkeley, conducted research showing that people who place a high value on happiness as a goal, people who actively and consciously try to be happy, actually report lower levels of positive emotion and higher levels of loneliness than those who do not make happiness a primary objective. The very act of monitoring yourself for happiness seems to interfere with the natural conditions that allow it to arise. The Zhuangzi illustrates this with characteristic humor and precision. It describes the things the world chases: wealth, status, fame, long life, a good reputation, and the things the world fears: poverty, obscurity, early death, a bad name. And then it asks a devastating question. What if all this running toward and running away is itself the cause of your suffering? What if the exhaustion of the chase is the very thing standing between you and the peace you are chasing? True contentment in the Taoist view is not a destination. It is a byproduct. It arises naturally when you stop fighting the present moment and start inhabiting it fully. When you stop measuring your life against an imaginary ideal and start experiencing it as it actually is. The Taoists called this practice Xin Zhai, the fasting of the heart-mind. A deliberate process of emptying yourself of ambition, judgment, preference, and resistance, not because these things are inherently evil, but because they create a kind of interior noise that drowns out the quiet intelligence of the Tao. When that noise settles, what remains is not emptiness in the bleak sense. It is clarity, stillness, a deep sense of okayness that does not depend on any external condition. The third area is the compulsive need to become someone other than who you already are. The Zhuangzi tells a beautifully absurd little story about a centipede, a snake, and the wind. The centipede, watching the snake move gracefully without any legs, feels deeply envious. The snake, observing the wind travel vast distances without even having a body, feels equally envious. But the wind, when asked, replies that it is hindered by even the smallest obstacle: a finger, a foot, a door left ajar. The point is elegant and quietly profound. Every form of existence has its own genius and its own limitation. Nothing in nature is purely superior or purely inferior. These judgments are human inventions, and they produce nothing but unnecessary suffering. And yet, we are drowning in this kind of self-rejection. The beauty industry is worth over $500 billion globally, built almost entirely on the premise that your natural appearance is insufficient. Social media algorithms are engineered to make you feel perpetually behind, not as wealthy, not as fit, not as traveled, not as purposeful, not as happy as other people appear to be. Education systems grade you against standardized curves rather than helping you discover your own authentic capacities. Laozi wrote that when people begin labeling things as beautiful, the concept of ugliness is simultaneously created. When good is named, evil appears. These are not opposites that exist independently in nature. They are paired constructs that the human mind generates together. You cannot have an ideal self without also creating a deficient self. And the pursuit of one guarantees the suffering of the other. So, what is the actual practice? What does it look like to live according to Wu Wei in the 21st century? The Zhuangzi recommends what it calls the middle path, not in the Buddhist sense, but in the sense of not overextending, not straining beyond your natural capacity, staying centered and resourced rather than burning yourself to ash in pursuit of some future version of your life. Laozi put it even more concisely. He wrote that the practitioner of Tao, seeking knowledge, adds something new each day, but the practitioner of Tao, seeking wisdom, removes something each day, until they arrive at non-action. And in non-action, nothing is left undone. Read that again slowly because it is genuinely radical. Nothing is left undone, not by doing more, not by trying harder, not by optimizing, grinding, or forcing, but by progressively releasing the internal clutter, the false beliefs, the ego-driven ambitions, the compulsive need to control outcomes, until what remains is a human being moving through life with the quiet power of a river finding its way to the sea. This does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean abandoning responsibility or ambition. It means aligning your effort with what is real and natural rather than with what is imagined and forced. It means acting from a place of inner alignment rather than anxious striving. It means trusting, perhaps for the first time, that the universe is not your enemy, that the natural course of things, if you stop fighting it, will carry you somewhere worth going. The Tao that can be fully explained is not the eternal Tao, but this much can be said. You are enough, right now, as you are, in this moment. The centipede does not need legs like the snake does not need freedom like the wind, and you do not need to become someone else to justify your existence. Stop trying to fix the world from a place of moral superiority. Let the river find its own shape. Stop chasing happiness like it is a thing you can catch. Let it arise the way warmth arises when you step into sunlight. Stop trying to become an idealized version of yourself. Let what you already are unfold the way a flower unfolds, not because it is trying, but because that is simply what it does. The ancient Taoists called this the art of effortless living, and it is not something you achieve. It is something you remember. You were born knowing how to do this. Life taught you to forget. Maybe it is time to start unlearning.